Hello and welcome back to the Bitcoin Mentor podcast. Today I had Edward Cafarella with me. Hi Edward, how are you?
Good, good. How are you doing today, Jake?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Edward, today we're going to have a chat about you and learn why you find Bitcoin exciting, learn why you've decided to become a Bitcoin mentor. And to do that, I like to take as much of a kind of backstory as we possibly can. And in my experience, everyone's journey is completely unique and often blends together, four or five different touch points in one's life that combine to go, oh, this is actually a big deal and I didn't realize before. So that's what we'll try and cover. So could you take me back and think about being a teenager and some of the passions that you had in life at the time, and maybe you studied at university, maybe you didn't, but what were some of the areas of expertise that you picked up in the early years of your life?
So, when I was really young, my dad bought me one of those do-it-yourself wiring electronics kits where you could like make little circuits, use resistors, transistors, you got to learn all the electrical components. And that, along with playing video games as a kid, really sparked my interest in technology and a passion for some programming, some IT stuff that I've done as a hobby my whole life. And obviously led into Bitcoin and has a lot of parallels with that. And as a teenager, I picked up playing bass guitar and I played that a lot, got really into music, art, all that stuff. I was in a couple bands throughout high school and into college. And yeah, those are the two big interests I've always had. And then somewhere along the way throughout college, I took a philosophy class, got really interested in philosophy, reading like the old Aristotle, Plato, all that stuff, and then some of the later philosophers of the more modern, like Nietzsche. I'm still really interested in all that stuff, and these are all passions that I still have till today, and I think they all kind of intertwine into Bitcoin in some weird way, and maybe we can get into that at some point today.
Mm. And they do. You don't realize at the time how the knowledge you're picking up becomes relevant later. And it's very strange where our interests take us. What immediately resonates for me, having you just told that initial story, is bass guitar. So I haven't played a bass guitar since probably almost 20 years now. But as a teenager, I also played bass in a couple of bands at school, and we do like Rolling Stones covers and the Strokes and shit like that. And it was actually some of the funnest kind of creative times I can remember. And frustratingly, I decided to kind of put all of that on hold in favor of focusing on business and money and stuff like that, rather than oh, you can't make money out of those things, so you got to drop that. And that was at least the kind of top down directive from the families that I grew up in and around. But yeah, that's great fun, isn't it? Just playing in bands, cruising around, doing stuff. You can't experience much better than like jamming with two or three friends.
Yeah, it really is, and what you said resonates with me a lot because I too, grew up being told you got to get a job and you got to make money, and music really isn't that kind of a gig. But it was always so interesting to me, and I had such a passion for it. I played a ton of Chili Peppers, and
Cool.
we played the Strokes, all that indie rock stuff. Was big when I was growing up, and I'm like 30 now. That was kind of the time zone we're dealing with.
Yeah.
I think it started with like Guitar Hero. Funny enough, we played that, and we're like, oh, all my friends were like, let's just pick up some real instruments and start playing.
No way. That's how you started, was on a video game first. No way.
Yeah, I mean, I was always still interested. I played violin in elementary school and then middle school and throughout high school. But the
Drop that
rock
for the
music,
guitar,
yeah,
obviously.
right, yeah, obviously the bass guitar. Then I got guitars. I'm fully invested.
And so from the technology perspective, I confess I use technology, but I've never been someone with that more engineering type brain that was like, well, how does this thing work? So talk me through that experience, and what was it that perhaps your dad is already a passionate technologist and that was a big influence, but what were some of the projects that you took on, and what did you pull apart, and what did you learn from that?
Yeah, yeah. So my dad doesn't do that as a living, but he'll like take apart old radios and restore them, and he's working on the circuit boards with that. So he does a great job with those things, and all that stuff kind of translated into my interest, I think, because in the more modern time, the computers and the phones getting more powerful, and the technology that I grew up with influenced me. And I got really into web development about right out of high school, I'd say. And I wanted to go to school for that in secondary school, like college and all that. And I ended up not pursuing it fully. I switched to philosophy and then I kind of dropped out. But I ran a little bit of a website development freelancing gig and did that for a few clients and found out it wasn't really my thing. I'm not good at the technical stuff in the programming sense as much as I'm interested in how the website actually works and like interested in running the servers. And that is a huge passion of mine now with running like a Bitcoin node and servers like that. More the IT side of it, I guess you could say. But the programming side has always just been more of a hobby and a passion. But it's all just been a learning process along the way as far as that goes. But I've always picked it up and put it down here and there. So.
And what's fun is, every team is a blend of different skills. And you need that person to go, hang on, how does that work? Because if you don't, then you wouldn't understand any of it in some ways. Yeah, interesting. Okay, and so as you kind of graduated and moved out of those earlier years, was there a particular profession that you fell into? And does that relate to Bitcoin in some way?
Some people could say it does. I just became a cook, and I've been cooking for years now and jumping around different jobs and whatnot. I've been at this one for a few years now, and I like to think that there's something about the creativity that comes with it and also the rigidness of recipes and the structure of when you're baking or you're cooking, following certain rules, but then having some freedom with it and tying that into the music that I grew up with, really being passionate about all that creativity, but then the programming and the technology being like rigid. I've always just loved cooking, and it's just always been a passion of mine. And I was even doing it growing up too, but as a profession, I love doing it, and it's something that to this day I still love doing. So, yeah.
Awesome. And so I guess that the burning question then becomes, how do you end up as a Bitcoin mentor if you're a professional chef? Right?
It's a good question.
Yeah. No, and let's explore that,
and
because the most important thing I think that these episodes will bring through is not just are we going to talk to, the founders of this business, and Ben Perrin's story is a wonderful one. 8 years building a YouTube channel. He's turned over every stone you could possibly turn over when it comes to checking these little tools and bits of product you can use. But Bitcoin's for everyone. And it's an opt-in system where you choose to be part of it. It doesn't care who you are or where you're from. And if you teach yourself, which is what we've all done, you can get to this point. It's incredibly compelling, and I love talking about it. So, yeah, why does a professional chef become a Bitcoin mentor?
Well, so I'll start you at the beginning of my Bitcoin journey.
Please,
and that was,
absolutely. I love this.
Yeah. So it was quite a while ago. My first touch point with Bitcoin was probably the end of 2014, early 2015. And this was about the time that I got into college and, like I said earlier, thought about pursuing computer science. And what really grabbed me with it was the technology and learning. I was watching Andreas Antonopoulos videos. I'm sure you are familiar with him. And he, I believe, was doing like networking jobs. So he had that technological background, and the way he spoke about it just clicked with me. This is a robust, decentralized, immutable, censorship resistant network. All the things that he talked about just really struck me as, wow, this is a really interesting technology. Now, as far as the economic side of it goes, I pursued that because of my interest in philosophy. And my philosophical journey started leading me into YouTube videos or this or that, and Austrian economists kept coming up. One of them, funny enough, was Peter Schiff. And this was less than a decade after the financial crisis. He was one of the only people that was really talking about it before it happened. And I was like, there has to be something about what he's on about that allowed him to have the foresight to see that this was going to happen and the systemic issues that we were facing. And, it's all philosophy, critical thinking. And I just dug down that rabbit hole, and I started reading Mises and Hoppe and
wow.
Yeah.
And this is all the way back in 2014, 15.
Yeah, these were happening about at the same time. Yeah,
cool.
and so for me,
10 years now, right? I mean, it's amazing.
It's coming up on 10. Yeah, it's been a slow burn, but the last few years have really accelerated ever since about COVID time. I really accelerated my learning journey. But yeah, like 10 years ago, I was kind of green on all those fronts, and I've consistently grown in all those aspects of my skill set, my life. And right about the COVID time, I really locked into Bitcoin and not everything else, like technologically, like the alternative coins and Ethereum and all those, and really understood why Bitcoin is separate from the rest. And I think that coming from all those different backgrounds, I was able to understand why it's the best economically, why it's the best technologically. The network itself is just superior to those of Ethereum and the likes. And yeah, and now I'm here and I'm, all these skills. I've just read books and I'm hungry for knowledge and learning on the internet. And it's, I think I have a pretty good grasp on how everything works. And I think that really helps me with my ability to teach people. And I've helped people with Bitcoin my whole learning journey.
Awesome. And I have so many different directions I want to take this in, but the Austrian economics side of this for me was a huge missing piece of the puzzle. Now, I did a university degree in business management, and a lot of that over 3-4 years touched on different fields of economics, and Austrian economics just wasn't even in there. Right? You don't realize at the time, but you're being churned out as the next wave of Keynesian thinkers that completely believe in this idea of a central bank and how the central bank's job is to do all the things they tell you it supposedly does. And that's very powerful. So anyone out there that's like, who's Mises? Go and read this guy's stuff. And it's incredibly helpful because it's like a lens on the world that actually makes sense from an economics perspective. Everyone is acting out of a self-interest perspective, and value is completely subjective depending on any individual's individual situation. And you go like, well, this all starts to make like way more sense. And in particular, when I talk to someone like yourself, Edward, who's had that kind of tinkerer mentality that also says, well, do you know what, the technology kind of makes sense too. That, for me as an investor, it's like, oh my gosh, those are dots all aligning at the same time going, this is really interesting. And what I want to draw out that really resonates for me is the idea of stripping away, okay, Bitcoin's different to the rest of this stuff. So could you talk to us why you think that's the case?
Well, I guess I'll start with the economics that I understand. And I always knew that there was only going to be 21 million Bitcoin. And I mean, that's nothing new to anyone that's understood Bitcoin from day one. I think that's one of the first things you hear. But to fully grasp that there's only 21 million, I think a lot of people that are in the space sometimes lose sight of how important that is for a money. But you have to imagine that being divided up with every individual, and the amount that you're given, if it was equally divisible between everyone on the planet, is somewhere in the realm of 2 to 300,000 satoshis. And we think of that and we go, okay, yeah, that's interesting, but that's right now, and that's not always going to be the case. There's going to be more people throughout time, and 100 years from now, there's a huge component into this fixed finite supply that we've never seen before as the human race, and no other asset has ever done even close to that. Gold, as much as it is hard compared to other commodities and even fiat currencies, it is still inflating at a pretty consistent 2 to 3% a year, people estimate. But yeah, so economically, I think there's just so much more to explore to that, and that I've always had that intuition that this is something really valuable, and that any little bit that you can get, I think one day could be worth a lot. There's a guy, CK Snarks, on Twitter.
Christian, yeah.
He has, yes, Christian. I was forgetting the name. And he has this line, 37 sats is generational wealth. And I just love that because he's referencing the mining reward in about, I think it's about 100 years for the block subsidy that'll be issued, and we forget that's all there's going to ever be. That will be someone's reward for 10 minutes of work in the future, and 100 years isn't that far in the grand scheme of things. So
no, sure, there's loads there. It's just incredibly hard to get your head around, and it's always so much easier to comprehend reality when you can look at past performance. You can look at how something else works. Oh, I can see how that works. But we've never had digital scarcity. Like, what is digital scarcity? And as you said, there's an issuance curve into the future where we can see exactly how much Bitcoin is going to be newly minted each day. And therefore, we can start to make at least a guess on where this thing might go. But what we do know for sure is there's never been anything like this before. So whatever our best guess is, it's completely wrong. And it's like, well, what happens if this is true? And you're right. When you first come across, I think it was in the Bitcoin Standard, which is obviously shout out to Saifedean, one of the most important books you can read in this journey. And he talks about the stock to flow index. And you're like, okay, so what does that mean? It's like, well, this is the total supply of said unit divided by the amount of new unit each year. And as you mentioned already, roughly speaking, we create 2% more gold every year. But those numbers are based on reported gold figures. The Federal Reserve hasn't done an audit on the amount of gold it has for 50 years. So who knows how much gold they've actually got? And this is what everyone thinks is correct. The International Gold Council says there's X many tons in the world. But is that true? We don't know. We can't truly verify it. And then, how much gold's created every year? Okay, well, I think you can probably have a better grasp of that in terms of mining production numbers that exist. But it's still very much 2% a year-ish that's created. And as of the most recent halving, Bitcoin has a superior stock-to-flow index to gold. And it's like, hang on. So this is now essentially the most scarce investable asset or money that exists. Holy shit. From an economics perspective, this is unheard of, right? You can see it caught my attention as well.
Yeah, and we're only, 15 years in, and there's more to go, and that stock flow is dropping and dropping. I think that the finite supply is a big part as far as the economics go with it, because if you want to have a good money, you need it to be, at the very least, deflationary in comparison to other fiat currencies. But I think that the finite supply really solidifies its power in comparison to other assets. But I think when you compare it to other cryptocurrencies, and I think a lot of people new to the space, into Bitcoin or into crypto, generally mistake Bitcoin's properties, like we say, decentralization and censorship resistance or immutability. And they think, oh, Ethereum must be like that too. It's a blockchain. It's a cryptocurrency. They're all decentralized and they're all censorship resistant. And I can only say that because I did believe that the first few years that I was into it. I assumed, oh, well, Ethereum has a fixed supply because Bitcoin has a fixed supply. And that I learned wasn't the case. That, and along with other aspects of just how they work and how the nodes operate and the size of the blockchain that you're downloading to your computer, these are all factors that play into how decentralized the network is and people's access to them. So that's to name a few things, but if you want to go into anything specific.
Well, definitely. So basically you were talking about this moment when you realized Bitcoin was different to everything else. And we talked through the kind of economic implications of finite supply, and now basically ticking into the slightly more technical side of things. So someone like yourself with a more like tinkerer type view of the world, like what were some of the moments when you realized, and please talk us through the technology specifically, that Bitcoin is actually different to these other things. You've already mentioned Ethereum, for example. There's a meme somewhere, crypto influencer, Crypto Ran Man, I can't remember the name of his show now, but he was caught on camera talking through the benefits of Bitcoin's fixed supply, and he's on CoinMarketCap and he flicks over to Ethereum and he's about to try and say the same thing, and then he can't because he realizes there isn't one. This is just classic moment. It's like he didn't even realize, and this guy's got thousands and thousands of followers and everyone believes what he says and doesn't even know what he's talking about. And it's very interesting. I had other people who had technological minds that I met that are like, Jake, have you ever tried to mine Ethereum? And I'm like, well, no, I haven't. And they're like, well, there's only a few people in the world that can do it because of the kind of computing power that's required. Therefore, you can't just run it as on a node at home. And if you wanted to capture Ethereum, well, you just go and talk to AWS, who probably does most of the mining. Perhaps some of that resonates, or were there any other kind of particular technological moments that you can remember?
Those are good examples. So my first touch point to Bitcoin, one of the things I wanted to do, being interested in the technology, was running my own. Bitcoin Core was a wallet and a miner, and you had to sync the entire blockchain back then onto your computer. So I remember doing that and trying to mine, and then my laptop started making a really loud noise. The fan started spinning, and I'm like, "What is going on here?" I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Well, this this isn't practical. I can't just leave this running all day. So it made me think about it. But because I only did it with Bitcoin, like I said, for those first couple of years, I didn't think about it with the other ones. And when I did finally decide I'm going to run my own Bitcoin node, I did that. And I started thinking, well, what about an Ethereum node? And seeing the size of the chain, and then, oh, well, you need a lot more bandwidth because it's downloading more faster. It's 30-second blocks. So there's a lot of hurdles to come over when you're trying to deal with other cryptocurrencies versus Bitcoin. Another one could be, I forget what it's called. See, I don't really remember like the crypto stuff because, oh, it's Infura, for Ethereum, but it's like what they use to connect to. Most wallets will use that as like their node that they connect to validate their wallets. But that's a huge deal because there's only one, and the reason why they have the one is because it's a full node, and what you're running when you try to run your own personal Ethereum node is actually just some like version of like a pruned node, like what we would do with Bitcoin. So you're not actually always storing the entire Ethereum blockchain. So all these things, I'm like, well, this isn't really decentralized then, and then I'm like, well, if Ethereum isn't, then why would Dash or Dogecoin or all these other cryptocurrencies be any different? Ethereum is the second best. I think that for a lot of people that are confused with crypto is making the comparison to Ethereum because pretty much everyone has heard of it. And I think that if you can pull the strings of problems with that one and you can address them technologically, you can start to understand why, okay, so if there's these issues with Ethereum, then the other ones, it kind of follows logically that the other ones are probably not doing something right either. I just remembered another one is the issuance of Bitcoin versus Ethereum. They've changed it multiple times. It's now deflationary, supposedly. I don't know, Ethereum gets burned. Bitcoin, like you said, we can predict 100 years into the future what the block subsidy is going to be on July 15th in 2100. So yeah, so all these factors are really important in understanding the differences.
Really important. And it's not obvious, when you get onto CoinMarketCap, it's just not obvious that this is the case. So frankly, anyone who's listening to this podcast, like, shout out to you. You're doing the work to figure out what the hell this thing is. And both Edward and I have spent countless hours trying to figure out what the hell's going on here. And it is one of those incredibly valuable moments in the process when you go, oh, hang on, maybe none of these other things are decentralized at all. And they're basically using that term to sell innovation, to sell security, and to sell a kind of anti-government thesis, which is frankly just co-opting lots of really poorly informed people, essentially. So people either chasing extraordinary gains or people who just haven't actually looked into what being decentralized means. And in some ways that's really scary, but in other ways it's actually very helpful because it makes it very clear, like, well, no, this thing's different and here's why. And I love looking at things like, how many nodes are being run globally on the Bitcoin network. And last time I checked, it was like 20,000 or something like that. And you think, okay, oh, they'll shut it down. They'll shut it down, Jake. You can't put, big money into Bitcoin. They'll shut it down. Okay, how are they going to find 20,000 nodes globally and shut them all off at exactly the same time and hope that no one had a backup anywhere?
Including the satellite that Blockstream has too, because
well, exactly. There you go. There's more.
It's gotten incredibly decentralized.
It's like you can't kill this thing even if you wanted to, and that's an incredibly exciting moment because this could be my savings tool forever. And it's not until you start looking at the mechanics of the underbelly, so to speak, that you can understand that. Oh, so cool, Edward. I love this stuff. So something I'd like to draw on next is you commented on how, you're picking up this knowledge and you're working through all these things and you're figuring stuff out, that you started teaching other people. What's that experience been like? And what are the kind of people that you've been teaching and what have you been teaching them?
Like most other Bitcoiners, when you learn about it, you just want to tell everybody and you're naturally going to fall to the people closest to you.
Stop talking about Bitcoin, whatever you do.
Yeah, I still hear it. My wife has to tell me to stop every once in a while. I'm
like,
yeah, you're right.
Bitcoin
you're right.
podcasts, so we can just talk to each other.
Yeah, so BitcoinMentor's helped me with getting that out of my system. But Yeah, it's it was a lot of like my family at first, helping them set up wallets and just showing them, oh, you can use Lightning now, and then, oh, look how cool this is, and they're interested and they find it interesting. I've gotten people in my family to take it seriously and use it, and then it spread into my work life. You're talking at work and someone brings up Bitcoin back in 2017, and there's something on the news about it, so they bring it up, and I'm like, oh, I've actually been reading about that and using it for a couple of years now. And then the next time it's in COVID and it goes up again, and Elon Musk is buying it, so people are talking about it, and you get all these points where you're talking to people in your daily life, and it becomes it for me. It was always like the people close to me, and just trying to bring it up in conversation when I hear someone, especially when they're talking about a problem that I think Bitcoin solves, the money and things like that. And we were talking earlier about, why did it click with me in 2020? And I think for a lot of people, it was the money. When listening to the Saylor series and
Yeah.
his whole
Fucking
discussion
awesome.
about, yeah, and I think there's a reason why he orange pilled a lot of people with that conversation, because really just powerful, big picture reasons why Bitcoin is so unique and why it's going to usurp other monies and properties. And yeah, and, people even to this day, still worried about inflation, and it's a great thing to bring up. You have to be careful not to talk about it too much, like I said, but because some people will know that you're the Bitcoin guy, and that's kind of been my philosophy with it, is letting people know you're the Bitcoin guy. Bring it up enough that they know that if they want to know more, they'll come to you, and that seemed to work for me. People come to me every once in a while, and I let them ask for what they want, and I give them a little crumbs here and there to lead them down some kind of a path of learning and their own little journey, so they feel like they're doing it themselves as well.
And I think that's a very sustainable approach. Over the years, I've tried a number of different ways of getting people to pay attention. And the moment that I flip it round and I think about what I get engaged by, people telling me I should do something is the last thing that I want to hear. If that makes sense. In like a kind of pushy fashion. It's like, you're idiots. You need to look at this thing or you're fucked. And it's an unhelpful process that not only stresses the person that's trying to share the message, but also the person on the receiving end is like, man, that's just not going to catch my attention. What does, though, and I think it's a very cool concept. I heard, actually, shout out to Mark Moss. He took me through this once. But like, if you look outside and you look at the tree outside your house, and you think of every single leaf that you can see on that tree as a representation of all the problems in the world, and then you draw back to the roots of the tree, you find the money printer. And what's actually more helpful is talking to people about their problems. And so let's focus in on that for a moment then, Edward. So you're maybe at work or just out and about at a coffee shop or something, and you overhear someone talking about Bitcoin. What would you say are the kind of top 2 or 3 problems that you come across that would instigate an interruption in their conversation, if that makes sense? They're like, oh, I've got to just tell them. Do you know what I mean?
When they're talking about Bitcoin specifically,
Well,
like
no,
they
no,
already
no
brought up
more. They're
Bitcoin, or
talking.
are you
They're
saying?
talk. You mentioned that you like talking to people about it when you can see that Bitcoin solves a problem that they have.
Right.
So, what are the kind of 2 or 3 problems that you see the most that you like to then, talk to someone about it?
Bring Bitcoin into the, yeah. Yeah, and I think the easy one first is the inflation problem. I live in America, and we've experienced, good amount of inflation here, especially with food.
Yeah.
Housing has
Wow.
been crazy. My generation specifically, I'm 30, so a lot of us are looking to get into housing, and there's a lot of people in my peer group that just can't buy a house. And for me, that I feel is the sore spot. And so it can be delicate. You don't want to tell people I have the answer to all your problems, but when you believe that it is the answer to all the problems, you feel like an obligation to sell it like that. And I think that, like I said, it's a fine line. You have to walk with it, but people need to hear how Bitcoin can help. And for millennials, Gen Z that want a house and want a family and feel like, I saved 10, 20,000, and then over the course of the last couple of years, that doesn't buy me half of what it did in terms of housing. That can be really discouraging. But when you show them, well, yeah, if you would have saved in Bitcoin or saved part of that in Bitcoin, your purchasing power would have actually doubled or tripled, or in some cases 10x over the course of long enough. And it doesn't require that much time, and it really just requires the conviction on that person's end to believe it and see it. And so for me, when I hear people talking about living in this apartment and I want to buy a house, that comes up. It's a good savings tool. I think that everyone, including people with houses, can benefit from it. But yeah, I feel like that's the biggest one for me, just because of my age and the people I'm surrounded with.
I feel your problem in the same sense that, so I'm 36, I've got two young kids and one on the way, and like, obviously everyone's framing is different in terms of what they can and can't afford, but the point is that the attainability for what you want to live in is moving away from you rather than coming closer to you if you don't take Bitcoin seriously. And yes, you might be able to find some other speculative assets to put money into, but that means that you become an overnight at home, investor, which is a full-time job, and it's very easy to get wrong. If you've only got 10 or 20 grand, you don't want to get it wrong. That's even worse. Suddenly it's all gone. And the useful thing here is the problem's very real. Like, you become a parent, like, as fathers, like, well, hang on, I've got to house my family somewhere. Now, ironically, I sold a house to buy Bitcoin to rent in a nicer area in a different house, and have since consequently moved cities. But the point being is that Bitcoin is a vehicle to store your purchasing power over time. And if it's a house you want to buy, that's helpful. If it's a car you want to buy, that's helpful. If it's a holiday you want to go on, it's helpful. If it's school fees you want to pay for, whatever, it's helpful. And I completely agree with you. It's a very compelling kind of use case. And inflation's become very real. Like, I ran a podcast called Bitcoin with Jake from, let's say, the middle of 2022 to 2023, and I had 80 episodes with people from all around the world. And when I would speak to someone, shout out to Mauricio from Leiden, for example. So Mauricio originally grew up in Venezuela, and so his story as to like what happened there politically over a generation and a half with his family, and then now being in Canada, was an incredible story of, oh my God, when the government really fucks with the money, this is what happens. And so for someone who's been through that experience, understanding that something's a fixed supply is really simple. It's like, yep, cool, okay, inflation's a massive issue, okay, done. Or equally, people from different countries in Africa that I spoke to, or other Southeast Asian regions, or even Central America, their life experience was very real in terms of inflation. Whereas now, places like the UK, Australia, where I'm now based, or yourself, Edward, in the US, inflation's become very real, where it wasn't, half a generation ago. And Bitcoin's a great tool for that. And so is there any other problems that you see coming up?
Not so much in my personal life, but I think for a lot of people that care about freedom and the basis that their money operates on, having something like you mentioned, the guy in Venezuela, having something that is censorship resistant, and I'm sure you're no stranger to political attacks on currency and whatnot. I mean, I know in Canada they have the trucker protests, and people's bank accounts were frozen. People in the US have gotten their bank accounts closed for having certain opinions on things, and this is the United States. You would assume that we have some level of freedom here. There are GoFundMe's that get shut down, accounts, maybe if you're a Twitch streamer or you have some kind of online service, your account gets shut down, you lose your livelihood. And these are things that, I'm very internet native. I grew up in that time, and I think that for me, it just makes sense to have a digital money. And along with that, you get something that no one can stop, no one can steal it from you. You can send it whenever you want, and you can receive it whenever you want too. There's all these benefits that come along with it that I think we take for granted in the first world countries, the Western countries. But nonetheless, there are people that do have to worry about it in these countries. And I think that there's something to be said about just having that freedom, even if you don't need it necessarily. I have a bank account here. I've never gotten it closed, but maybe it happens. You never know. And I have a very paranoid, somewhat mindset of, thinking about the worst case scenarios and, thinking about what could go wrong and trying to mitigate the fallout of that. So I've always had this idea of how can I safeguard myself, my family, my wealth, everything I've worked for, from anything that could happen. And I try to do my best doing that. Everyone has blind spots, and everyone does their version of what's best. But yeah, I mean, politically speaking, There's a lot of turmoil going on in the US right now. There's election year, there's all this uncertainty, and I think people need to know that there's an option for money that you can use, receive, spend without any interruption or interference.
Hmm. And I think that's the kind of core feature set. It's like you can receive value, you can send value, and you can store value with confidence. And that's all it really needs to say in some ways. Um, the thing from the Saylor series, many things, but for those of us that have spent 10 hours as if we're in like the same room as the two of them just chatting away, Saylor talked about having a superpower, and the average cartoon would go for laser eyes or being invisible or something. But
I know exactly where you're going because this was one of my favorite parts about it too.
yeah,
Yeah.
he was like,
Yeah.
actually, what you want to be is you want to be completely unkillable. Doesn't matter what anyone else does, you just cannot be killed. And that's what Bitcoin is. It's just this thing that just cannot be killed. And you're like, whoa. And it's so stupid, like the learning journey and how simple we need things to be sometimes. Oh, okay. And you already mentioned the issuance schedule with Ethereum changing. The point of Bitcoin and its beauty is it just hasn't changed. Yes, the mechanics of it are evolving in terms of the hash power, in terms of the price action, in terms of the user base. But what it's doing every single 10 minutes is exactly what it did when it started. And that's what's so exciting about it. It's that consistency, that reliable side of things that is missing everywhere else in our life. And, I mean, I like the word paranoid because I'm not paranoid enough, I don't think. And therefore, if I was looking for a Bitcoin mentor, that would be something that would catch my attention. It's like, oh, okay, if I get set up in the same way as Edward, then I will kind of tick that more paranoid box. I like that a lot. Before we go into the last phase of this conversation around your experience becoming a mentor and the kind of people that you're hoping to help, I just want to touch back on that idea of inflation in relation to food. Because as a chef, I'm sure you see, like, at the coalface how things are changing. And it will just be a really fun, I'd love to learn, like, what's it been like? If you're selling people food that you prepare every day and your ingredients cost is going up, what happens?
I don't do the ordering specifically, but I work, very closely with people that do. So I get to see, a case of eggs or ground beef that we get in, the price that's changed over the last few years. It's crazy. Unfortunately, at previous jobs I've had, there's been times where ingredients get substituted because they become too expensive. And, I mean, everybody knows that when they calculate inflation numbers, if one product in that basket of goods goes way up, they take it out and they substitute it with something similar so that it kind of drops down what the inflation print is for that month. So I see it happening with the food stuff, and I go to the grocery store even, and I'm very conscious of what I eat because I cook for a living, and trying to find food that doesn't have seed oils in it, I think it's become the new filler, the new, let's fill this thing up with something dense in calories so that we can not spend the money on actual like butter or whatever the thing was made of 30 years ago. It's really crazy. I don't attribute any malice to it. I think that these are companies that are just trying to make money, and their margins are probably squeezed very thin. And like I said, working with people in a restaurant or in a kitchen, you can only sell your product for so much before people stop coming in the door. So sometimes you're forced to make a tough choice. And knowing what I know about Bitcoin and the ability that a restaurant could have, for instance, in, let's say, saving in Bitcoin or taking it as a money for selling their service or goods, and holding that and being able to use some of that profit that they've made on buying the real food and buying the good food, the quality ingredients, it creates a cycle of betterment for the people that come to eat there in the future. And I think that right now we're kind of in the opposite of that. We're like, oh, we're taking dollars in, and our dollars are getting inflated, so now we have less money in a year because of inflation, and we have to buy the less healthy food. That makes sense. It becomes like a vicious cycle in the opposite direction when I see we could be using Bitcoin. And I don't have that kind of power where I work, but everyone certainly knows that is what I think. So
And even if you did have the power to say we accept Bitcoin, the truth of the matter is Bitcoin isn't freely spent every day. Actually, the incentive is the other way around. I want to keep my Bitcoin and I'd like to sell my dollars. So I'm getting paid in this stuff. I want to just get rid of it as soon as I can because the way it inflates. Either buy Bitcoin with it, great strategy, or you run your expenses in fiat still. It's so interesting though, isn't it? So as a kitchen, you have the economic kind of force on the one end of like the reality of the cost of ingredients. And there's not a lot you can do about that, right? I'm sure there is some haggling from your specific partners that you use. And on the flip side of that, it's like, well, you've got to be able to have a sign out the front of your restaurant which says, you can have a meal for whatever the price point is for the local area and the type of product that restaurant is moving. But there comes a point where you can't put the prices up anymore, or you feel like you can't put the prices up anymore. Maybe you could, or maybe there's some marketing guru that could work their magic. But it's still it's still a sense, isn't it? It's an energy pushing the other way, and so the restaurateur has to make a hard call, and it's we either go out of business or we change something. And the thing to change, which causes the least hassle, is the ingredients. Or at least that's what I feel from this explanation you're giving me. And with that, the quality of the food drops.
no, I was saying if people see a burger on the menu, they don't necessarily care if you use canola oil to grease the grill or something a little healthier, and these things add up in cost. People just at the end of the day want the burger or they want the seafood platter. Yeah, it really does affect the business. You can't charge double what your competitors are. People aren't coming in the door.
Yeah, wow. And there's then that strange kind of like meta analogy to that, which is the guys that are organizing the CPI weight. I learned recently, for example, here in Australia, the Australian Bureau of Statistics is now openly admitting to changing the CPI weighting every year. So the CPI numbers that they give you today, if you compare them to last year, you're not comparing the same formula. It's deceit at the very top of the pile, right? And it's one of the things that drives me so fucking mad. Okay, so the one metric that we're supposed to all use to compare whether or not purchasing power is being retained is in itself doctored to high hell. So you can't. But it's a good analogy, though, for people who don't understand what I mean by the CPI weight. So the CPI being the Consumer Price Index, which is a government metric to measure the cost of a basket of goods to supposedly reflect the change in prices for the average consumer. But like the restaurant that Edward has just described, if one of the inputs to this basket is becoming too expensive, say the extra virgin olive oil is now too much to use every day, so you just swap it out for canola oil and say it's a like for like change, and something has changed on the back end that means that the olive oil market was out of control this year and therefore we couldn't include it. It was a complete anomaly, and the CPI metric is therefore kind of reduced. A very good example as to how they play around with these numbers on the back end, and how really anything that comes out of central government in terms of these data points can't be trusted. Which is an awful point, because then it's like, well, who do we trust? Well, maybe we trust the unkillable digitally native money that is being controlled by 20,000 individual nodes, completely impregnable in different parts of the world. Maybe it's a good idea. I want to understand, you obviously heard about the Bitcoin Mentor and you reached out, you got involved. So for anyone out there that's listening, that's looking to hire a mentor, what would you also like to share with those people?
So I'd like to think that I am on the more technical end of what you'd be looking for. I'm also very down to earth. I like to think that someone can come to me and it's just like hanging out with your friend. I'm very personable. I'm very easy to talk to. And I think that technically minded people that want help with running a node, this is the kind of stuff I do. I've run nodes, for 5 to 6 years now, like 24/7, setting up wallets. I've constantly on the internet looking up like new Lightning wallets, eCash, Bitcoin, all these different things, and always have my finger on the pulse of the new thing that's coming out and trying to understand it. Ben with BTC Sessions is great for that kind of information, and I've learned a lot from him. And I think that when I found Bitcoin Mentor, it kind of just was like the perfect fit for me because I love teaching people things and I love to help people grow, and especially in something like Bitcoin where I think it's so important for everybody. And I love just dealing with technology. I love to just tinker with things. I love to work with these tools. So I just want to, be able to help people become sovereign. I want to help people have that freedom of I can spend my money. It's FU money. I could do what I want with it. No one can take it from me. And I want them to feel like they're protected against inflation. They have that tool that'll help them get the house, or, something down the line that they're have a goal to purchase that maybe, the fiat money system just hasn't let them do for the last 5-10 years.
Edward, I'm absolutely convinced after our conversation today that there'll be people out there that really resonate with your story and would love your help. And it just so happens to be that we had all of these touch points in our life that took us down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and we learned all this stuff, and now the student becomes the teacher. And Bitcoin Mentor is, we launched in Australia only 2 weeks ago, and we've been running this podcast now for a couple of weeks. It's very evident to me now that this is a business model that doesn't really exist in the Bitcoin space yet, in that it's an education company that sells expertise by the hour, and it's very accessible, so people can just jump on the website, decide what they need, and book it. And that wasn't previously an option. We spent years digging around in websites that no one's ever heard of, trying things that didn't work, and now you can access that expertise pretty straightforwardly. But I think that the thing that's really resonated most is this idea of a mentor. So as we close up the conversation, is there anything else that you'd like to share as we finish off?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that wherever you're coming from for Bitcoin knowledge, like you said, mentors help guide people. I want to help you along your own journey, steer you in the right direction. And if you're interested in hearing more about what I have to say or looking into me, I'm Live Free BTC on Twitter. And I actually run the Bitcoin Mentor Q&A spaces that as of right now we're doing on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern time. So people can come into there and ask us questions. We usually have a guest on and we talk about Bitcoin on there. And it's been hugely helpful for me to learn, and the guys that come on, the other mentors that help in the conversation, it's been great. So I just want to leave that open to people that want to hear us talk to and maybe ask us questions before they even book a session. I think it's a great way for them to get in touch.
How's the spaces been? I have run spaces in the past. Have you had many people turn up and have a listen in? And I think they're really fun because when you listen to a pre-recorded podcast, you can't stick your hand up and ask a question, whereas with the spaces you can. Have you found people doing that?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And some days, depending on the guest, we can get only 5-10 people at a time in the audience. Sometimes we have upwards of 50 to 100 people. And I have to say, we have a pretty loyal core following that tends to come pretty regularly to no matter who we have on. And I'd say we get at least one question. Sometimes we have too many questions and we can't answer them in the hour that I'm running it. So, but it's great because you get to hear people that have some weird problem that you might not have known about. And one of the mentors comes up and they're like, oh yeah, I know that. And then they help them. And maybe you learned that, or, you got to get an insight into what people are actually hungry to learn. So it's been really great. Yeah.
Because the funny thing as well is that the fact there's maybe only 5 people on one call and 50 on another call, which from a kind of attention perspective is a 10x difference. You can get just as much value with only 4 or 5 people listening as you can with 50 people listening or 500 people listening. It's just the nature of how those platforms work. It's very cool how we're able to go out and learn this stuff. Awesome. Well, I encourage anyone out there to find Edward on X and to check out those Spaces sessions to learn more. And where would be the best place to get in touch to book a session with you? Just on the website, I guess.
Yeah, you can go right on the website, or you can email me. It's just edward@bitcoinmentor.io. And that's probably the best place to reach out, or you can maybe DM me on Twitter or X. I'll probably answer there as well. So
I wonder how long it's going to be whilst we say it's Twitter or X. I found myself saying X more X, recently, but
yeah, I'm getting there, but it's still Twitter.
Takes a bit of time, doesn't it? Well, Edward, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jake. I appreciate you too.